Hello folks, this is Abhay Ahire and I'm working as a team lead at Thinkitive Technologies Private Limited, and in today's video we are going to see what is microservice architecture, and along with that we will see how Spring Cloud help us in building microservices architecture. So without any delay, let's jump into microservices architecture.
Today's video we are going to see microservice architecture with Spring Cloud. So before jumping into the microservice architecture, let's see agenda of today's video. So we are going to see what are monolithic applications first, and then we will see what is microservice architecture. And once we understand the architecture, we are going to see advantages as well as challenges in microservices architecture. And to connect to the system or to get an idea, basic idea about microservice architecture, we will consider an healthcare microservices example. And then finally, main agenda behind this video is to understand Spring Cloud and its different component, which helps us to build the microservice architecture pretty easily. So let's start the video and let's see monolithic application. What are monolithic applications? It is nothing but just a traditional model for designing the software applications. And what is that model? In that model particularly, all business logic is added into the single piece of software. And what does that mean? In this diagram, if you can see particularly, this is the UI client, which can be a web browser, a mobile, or any other API client that is requesting some information from your application. And if your application consists of 10 or 20 or n number of services, all that logic will be added into the single application, and this application is communicating to this database, which is used to store or retrieve the information for that application. This is the architecture, or this is the pattern or model we can say is called as monolithic application. There are few advantages of monolithic application as well. In terms of deployment, if we say we are going to manage a single piece of or single unit of software, so it's a bit easy to manage the single piece of software as a monolithic application in terms of deployment or operations. But there are few disadvantages of monolithic applications as well. Suppose your application goes down, then you will not be able to access a single service in your monolithic application. So there are few advantages and disadvantages comes with monolithic application. Now we understood monolithic application, so let's see what is microservices architecture. So what is microservices architecture? It's nothing but an architectural style for developing application, and it defines a pattern to develop an application into smaller individual modules. And what does that mean? Suppose you are having n number of services in your application, then you can create n number of microservices to achieve modularity in your application. In this diagram, if you see particularly, there is an UI client, but it is not communicating to the single unit of the application. It is communicating to 3 different microservices, and each of the microservices is having its own database. Again, it's not necessary for each microservice to have its database. It completely depends upon the design patterns to develop a microservice architecture. We will see that in the next part of this series. So let's see some advantages of microservice architecture. I have listed down few advantages of microservices over here. First one says scalability. It is pretty easy to scale up microservices. Flexibility, as we have created individual microservices for individual feature, it is pretty flexible and loosely coupled. Modular architecture means we have introduced modularity in our architecture as we have created individual services. Ease of introducing new features means suppose you are having already 10 services and you want to introduce a new feature, you can create a new microservice for that. So it is pretty easy to introduce a new feature. More reliable and robust structure comes along with the microservices architecture. Along with that, you can create the microservices language independently. And what I mean by that, suppose you have created 5 microservices in Java and you can create one more service in Nodejs, so that doesn't hurt. So those are the few advantages of microservices. Let's see challenges in microservices. Cost management. As we have seen in monolithic application, we are managing a single unit of application, so it was pretty easy for deployment. And in terms of microservices architecture, suppose you are dealing with 10 or 20 microservices, then you need to manage or host them in 10 or 20 servers according to number of your microservices. Network latency and load balancing means suppose you are having 20 instances or multiple instances of particular microservice, then in that case you need to do load balancing. And what is high risk due to intercommunication between microservices? Suppose there are 3 to 4 microservices, they need to communicate with each other to exchange some information, and one of the microservices goes down, then because of that entire chain will break, and that is the high risk due to intercommunication. Complexity in end-to-end testing means suppose we are having a chain of microservices, then it is pretty difficult to test rather than a a monolithic application for end-to-end testing. So those are the advantages and challenges in microservices architecture. Let's consider an healthcare microservices architecture example. So I have listed down 3 different microservices over here: appointment service, patient service, and provider service. So appointment service will be used to create appointment, patient service will handle patients, and provider service that can be used to manage information about physician, provider, specialist, whatever you want to say. So let's take a look at Spring Cloud components and how Spring Cloud helps us in building microservices architecture. So there are different components I have listed down over here: Spring Cloud config server, pane client. We are going to see all of them one by one. So let's see what is the use of Spring Cloud config server. So before jumping into the config server, let's go back to our example of microservice architecture. We are having 3 different microservices over here, and in our application we need to manage different configurations for each of the microservice. That configurations may involve database credential and other stuff you want to manage for each microservice. And in these cases, suppose we are not having a configuration server, then in that case operation guy who is handling the management or deployment of our microservices needs to go into each service and update the configuration for those particular services. Then how Spring Cloud config server helps us in this case? It provides ease of managing configuration of multiple microservices at single place. Configurations can be managed within the application YAML or property file within the Git repo. So whenever you are going to create a config server, you will need a Git repo. Each microservice can connect to config server and get required configuration. Let's understand it with the help of a diagram. So here are those 3 microservices we have just seen: appointment service and provider service. And here is the config server that Spring Cloud provides us. And what config server is doing at, it is connecting to a Git repo. Git repo is fetching the properties as per the microservice name from the file storage, and that information is provided to each of the microservices. So whenever the operation guy wants to update the configuration for particular microservice, he can simply go into the Git repo and update the particular configurations for particular microservice. So he don't need to visit individual microservices for updating configuration for that particular microservice. So that is the particular role of config server. We have seen how to manage configurations at central place for different microservices. Let's see how microservices can communicate with each other. There can be a scenario where 2 microservices need to communicate with each other. In that case, Spring Cloud comes with the pane client that can be used to establish communication between 2 microservices. So that is the whole responsibility of pane client. What is Eureka server? Eureka server enables you to register microservices you built, and it is referred as a service registry. Suppose you have created 3 microservices, as in our case appointment, provider, and patient. Then you can simply register those services in the Eureka server, and that thing is called as service registry. And also it enables you, suppose appointment service wants to talk to the provider service, then appointment service can simply go to the Eureka server and it can check whether provider service is up or not, and it can tell Eureka server that I need to communicate to the provider service. That thing is called as service discovery, and Eureka, which is also called as naming server, facilitates us with that feature. Let's try to understand Eureka server with following image. Here we can see provider service. There are 2 instances of appointment service, instance 2 and instance 1, and all of them have registered themselves in Eureka server. Also we can see the Spring Cloud balancer, which comes with Spring Cloud. It automatically manages or does load balancing for us. In this case, provider service wants to talk to the appointment service, and simply here we can see appointment service has registered itself in Eureka server. So provider service will be able to talk to the appointment service, and this thing is called as service discovery, and registering themselves into the Eureka server is called as service registry. So that is all about Eureka naming server. So now let's understand what is Cloud Gateway. In latest versions of Spring Boot, Spring comes with its own API gateway, that is Spring Cloud Gateway. In earlier versions of Spring Boot, we are using Netflix API gateway. But what is API gateway? It is nothing but a single and unified entry point across one or more internal APIs. And what do you mean by that? Let's understand it with the help of following image. So in this case, client wants to communicate with the provider service or appointment service, but instead of communicating with the services directly, it's talking to the Spring Cloud Gateway, and it is its whole and sole responsibility is to delegate the request to the particular microservice and get the response back to the client. So what are the advantages of Spring Cloud Gateway? We are opening minimum number of ports to the hackers in terms of security. Plus we can implement robust authentication and authorization mechanism at single place, that is Spring Cloud Gateway. So those are the few advantages of Spring Cloud Gateway. See few more components of Spring Cloud. So what are those? Under resilience 4J, Spring Cloud comes with circuit breakers, retry and fallback, and rate limiting. Let's see how those works. Suppose we are having a chain of microservices like this. Appointment service is talking to the provider service, provider is talking to the payment service for adding some payment or whatever it may be, but unfortunately payment service is down. In this case, entire chain might fail because of the single microservices, because our payment service is down. So circuit breakers comes in help to handle this. And what we can do, we can specify response to the caller in terms of failure. So suppose payment service is down, then we can specify a response in the provider service itself, and it will return back to the appointment service with that response. Also, we can limit the number of requests to the service with respect to time. Suppose we want to limit the 100 requests per second for the payment service, then we can do that with the help of this rate limiting feature. Retry and fallback, what is it? Suppose a payment service is down, then we can specify retry after 30 seconds or 60 seconds, how much time you want to configure, and once payment service is down, we can continue our chain. So those are the few advantages or few more components in the Spring Cloud. So that is all about microservices and Spring Cloud and its various components to build a microservices architecture. So thank you for holding up so long, folks. Bye bye.